Sarah Miller jolted awake, her heart pounding against her ribs. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its deep resonance seeming to shake the very foundations of the house. 3 a.m. Again. She turned to look at the empty space beside her, a familiar ache blooming in her chest as she remembered her late husband, David. The darkness pressed in around her, almost tangible in its intensity. Sarah shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Something felt off. It wasn't just the grief that had been her constant companion since David's passing. This was different. Unsettling. "Mom?" A small voice called from the doorway, barely audible over the sudden, inexplicable ringing in Sarah's ears. She sat up, squinting into the shadows. "Ethan, what's wrong, sweetie?" Her youngest son, only 7 years old, stood clutching his stuffed dinosaur. His eyes were wide with fear, darting around the room as if searching for something Sarah couldn't see. "I heard something in my room. Whispers. And scratching." Sarah's blood ran cold. She forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's probably just the wind, honey. Come here." As Ethan climbed into bed with her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't just tonight. Strange things had been happening ever since they moved into this old Victorian house 3 months ago. Objects moving on their own, cold spots that defied explanation, and now, whispers. "Where's Jake?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing her older son wasn't in his room. "He's in the bathroom," Ethan mumbled, burrowing closer to her. "But he's been in there a long time. He didn't sound like himself." Sarah's mind raced. Jake, her 12-year-old, had been acting strange lately, withdrawn, irritable, and sometimes different, like he wasn't quite himself. She'd attributed it to grief, to the difficulty of adjusting to a new home without his father. But now, a terrible suspicion began to form in the back of her mind. A loud thud from down the hall made them both jump. "Jake?" she called out, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. No response. "Stay here, sweetie," she whispered to Ethan, carefully getting out of bed. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me, okay?" Ethan nodded, his lower lip trembling. As Sarah stepped into the hallway, she heard the soft click of the lock behind her. The hallway stretched before her, shadows dancing in the corners of her vision. The floorboards creaked under her feet, each step feeling like it might be her last. "Jake?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Sarah's hand shook as she reached for the bathroom doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, so cold it almost burned. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror was covered in a thick layer of frost, impossible in the summer heat. Scratched into the frost were 3 words that made Sarah's blood run cold. "He's ours now." "Jake," Sarah cried out, panic rising in her chest. She rushed to his bedroom, flicking on lights as she went, desperate to dispel the oppressive darkness. Jake's room was a disaster, clothes and toys strewn everywhere. But no Jake. And there, on the wall above his bed, written in what looked horribly like blood. The attic. Sarah's mind reeled. They didn't have an attic, at least not one they'd found since moving in. But as she stood there, paralyzed with fear, she heard it. A soft giggle from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, Sarah made her way to the end of the hall. There, where there had never been one before, was a door. An old, weathered door that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Sarah reached for the handle, her entire body trembling. As her fingers brushed the cold metal, a voice drifted through the wood. It sounded like Jake, but not quite. "Come join us, Mother," the voice said, a cruel amusement in its tone that Jake had never possessed. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the door. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But as the giggling intensified, joined by other darker sounds, Sarah knew this was all too real. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her very soul, that whatever was behind that door wasn't her son anymore. Something had taken Jake, and it wanted Ethan too. As Sarah ran back to her room, desperate to protect her youngest, one thought burned in her mind. She would do whatever it took to save her boys, no matter what horrors she had to face. The next morning dawned with an unnatural stillness. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee clutched in her trembling hands. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to a sleepless night spent holding Ethan close, jumping at every creak and whisper in the old house. Jake was gone. The police had come and gone, leaving behind pitying looks and empty reassurances. They didn't believe her frantic tale of frost-covered mirrors and blood-written messages. To them, it was a simple case of a runaway boy and a mother on the edge of a breakdown. But Sarah knew the truth. She had seen the impossible door, had heard the voice that wasn't Jake's. This was something beyond the realm of normal explanations, and she was terrified. A knock at the door made her flinch violently, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. For a brief, hopeful moment, she thought it might be Jake. But when she opened the door, she found Father Michael, the priest from the local church. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his kind eyes filled with concern. "May I come in? I think we need to talk." Sarah nodded mutely, stepping aside. As they sat in the living room, Father Michael leaned forward, his face grave. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and urgent, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. Leave nothing out, no matter how impossible it might seem." Sarah took a shuddering breath and recounted the events, her voice breaking as she described the thing that had taken Jake's place. To her surprise, Father Michael didn't look skeptical or doubtful. Instead, his face grew increasingly pale. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the cross at his neck. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I believe you, and I fear we're dealing with something far more dangerous than I initially thought." Sarah's eyes widened, a mix of relief and terror washing over her. You believe me? But how? Why?" Father Michael sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older. "Because, Sarah, this house has a history. A dark history that the church has been monitoring for generations." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "What you're describing, it's not a ghost or a simple spirit. It's something much older, much more malevolent. A demon that has been bound to this land for centuries." The word demon hung in the air between them, heavy and terrifying. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, goosebumps rising on her arms despite the summer heat. A demon? But how? Why my Jake? "This entity," Father Michael explained, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, "it feeds on innocence, on potential. Children are particularly vulnerable, and your family's grief, your pain over losing David, it created an opening, a vulnerability that the demon could exploit." Sarah's mind reeled with this information, guilt and fear warring within her. "So this is my fault? Because I couldn't protect them from our grief?" "No," Father Michael said firmly, reaching out to grasp her hand. "This is not your fault, Sarah. Grief is natural, human. The demon is the one to blame here, not you." Sarah nodded, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "So how do we get Jake back? How do we stop this thing?" Father Michael's expression turned grim. "The church. They have protocols for dealing with possessions and demonic activity. But they're slow, bureaucratic. By the time they act, it might be too late for Jake." "Then what can we do?" Sarah asked, desperation clear in her voice. Father Michael hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "There's someone I know. Someone not officially sanctioned by the church. But she has experience with these things, real power. She might be our best chance at saving Jake quickly." "Who is she?" Sarah asked, a glimmer of hope rising in her chest. "Her name is Madame Celeste," Father Michael replied. "Some call her a psychic, others a medium. But in truth, she's something much more. A true priestess of the old ways." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Take me to her. Now." As they drove through the winding country roads, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The rational part of her brain still rebelled against all of this. Demons, priestesses, ancient evil. But then she remembered Jake's room, the frost-covered mirror, the voice that wasn't his, and she knew there was no going back. They pulled up to a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of town. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze, and the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and incense. Before they could even knock, the door swung open. A woman stood there, tall and regal, with long silver hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through Sarah. When those eyes met hers, Sarah felt a jolt, as if the woman was seeing not just her, but every pain, every fear, every hope she'd ever had. "I've been expecting you," Madame Celeste said, her voice rich and melodious, with an undercurrent of power that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. "Come in. We have much to do, and little time to do it." As Sarah stepped over the threshold, she felt a shift in the air, like she was crossing into another world entirely. Whatever happened next, she knew her life would never be the same. For Jake, for Ethan, she would face whatever horrors awaited. The demon had no idea what it had awakened in her. A mother's love, fierce and unyielding, ready to battle the very forces of darkness themselves. The interior of Madame Celeste's cottage was a stark contrast to its unassuming exterior. Shelves lined with ancient-looking books and jars filled with mysterious substances covered every wall. Crystals and talismans hung from the ceiling, tinkling softly as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify, something old and powerful. "Sit," Madame Celeste instructed, gesturing to a round table in the center of the room. As Sarah and Father Michael took their seats, the priestess busied herself gathering various items from around the room. Sarah's eyes were drawn to a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw Jake's reflection in it, his eyes wide with terror. But when she blinked, it was gone. "What you saw was real," Madame Celeste said, making Sarah jump. The priestess hadn't even been looking in her direction. "The veil between worlds is thin here. It allows us to see glimpses." Sarah's heart raced. "You mean Jake is alive? He's okay?" Madame Celeste's expression turned grave as she sat down across from them. "He lives, yes, but okay is not a word I would use. The demon that has taken him, it's ancient and powerful. Every moment Jake spends in its grasp puts him in more danger." "Then we have to hurry," Sarah said, leaning forward. "How do we get him back?" "First," Madame Celeste said, her piercing gaze locking onto Sarah's, "you must understand what we're dealing with. This isn't a simple haunting or possession. This demon has been bound to the land where your house stands for centuries." "Bound?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Madame Celeste sighed, her fingers tracing patterns on the table's surface. As she did, Sarah could have sworn she saw the wood ripple like water. Long ago, when the first settlers came to this area, they encountered a native tribe that warned them about the land. They spoke of an evil spirit that devoured the souls of children. The settlers, in their arrogance, ignored the warnings and built there anyway. "But nothing happened for all these years," Father Michael interjected, his brow furrowed. "Why now?" "The binding spell," Madame Celeste explained, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality, almost like a chant. "The native shaman managed to bind the demon to the land, but such bindings weaken over time. It's been waiting, gathering strength, looking for the right moment, the right family." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, goosebumps rising on her arms despite the warmth of the room. "And that's us? But why?" Madame Celeste reached out, taking Sarah's hands in her own. Her touch was warm, almost uncomfortably so, as if the priestess's skin contained a hidden fire. "Grief, my dear. Your grief over your husband, your boys' grief over their father. It created a vulnerability, an opening that the demon could exploit." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, a mixture of guilt and anger burning in her chest. "So this is my fault? Because I couldn't protect them from our pain?" "No," Madame Celeste said firmly, her grip on Sarah's hands tightening. "This is not your fault. Grief is natural, human. The demon is the one to blame here, not you. In fact, your love for your children will be crucial in what's to come." Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "So how do we get Jake back? How do we stop this thing?" Madame Celeste's expression turned grim, her eyes taking on an otherworldly glow. "It won't be easy. The demon has taken Jake to its own realm, a dark mirror of our world. We'll need to perform a ritual to open a gateway and bring him back." "Whatever it takes," Sarah said without hesitation, a fierce determination replacing her fear. "Just tell me what to do." Madame Celeste nodded approvingly. "Your love and determination will be powerful weapons against the darkness." She turned to Father Michael. "I'll need your help as well, Father. Your faith, combined with my knowledge of the old ways, will be crucial in battling this evil." Father Michael nodded solemnly, his hand unconsciously moving to the cross at his neck. "Of course. Anything to save Jake." "Good," Madame Celeste said, standing up. The air around her seemed to shimmer. as if reality itself was bending to her will. We'll need to gather supplies and prepare. The ritual must be performed at the stroke of midnight in the house where Jake was taken. As they made preparations, Sarah's mind was racing. Part of her still couldn't believe this was happening. Demons, other realms, magic rituals, it all seemed so impossible. But then she thought of Jake's black eyes, of the voice that wasn't his, and she knew she would do whatever it took to bring him home. The day passed in a blur of activity. Madame Celeste sent them on errands to gather specific herbs, candles, and other mystical items. Each object seemed to hum with hidden power, and Sarah found herself handling them with a mixture of awe and trepidation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, they made their way back to Sarah's house. Standing on the porch, Sarah hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. The house loomed before her, dark and foreboding. She could almost feel the malevolent presence waiting inside, hungry and patient. "Are you ready?" Madame Celeste asked gently, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah took a deep breath, drawing strength from the touch. She thought of Jake, alone and scared in some dark realm. She thought of Ethan, who needed his brother back. She thought of David, and how he would want her to be strong for their boys. "Let's get my son back," she said, her voice steady and determined. As they stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Sarah led them to the living room, where Madame Celeste began setting up for the ritual. Candles were placed in a precise pattern, herbs were burned in a silver bowl, and strange symbols were drawn on the floor with what looked unsettlingly like blood. "Remember," Madame Celeste said as she worked, her voice low and intense, "no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, do not break the circle. The demon will try to trick you, to lure you out. You must resist, no matter how painful or tempting its illusions might be." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, she couldn't help but wonder, what horrors awaited them on the other side, and would her love be enough to save Jake from the darkness that had claimed him? The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime, its deep, resonant tones marking the approach of midnight. Sarah, Father Michael, and Madame Celeste stood in a triangle around the intricate symbols drawn on the living room floor. The air crackled with an unseen energy, making Sarah's skin prickle and her hair stand on end. "It's time," Madame Celeste said, her voice low and serious. Her eyes, usually a deep green, now glowed with an otherworldly light. "Remember, no matter what happens, stay in the circle. The demon will try to deceive you, to lure you out. You must resist for Jake's sake." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the others could hear it. She thought of Jake, her sweet, brave boy, and steeled her resolve. Whatever horrors lay ahead, she would face them to bring her son home. As the final chime of midnight faded away, Madame Celeste began to chant in a language Sarah didn't recognize. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with power. Father Michael joined in, his Latin prayers intertwining with the priestess's ancient incantations. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, their flames stretching impossibly high before plunging the room into darkness. Sarah gasped, fighting the urge to run. She felt a warm hand grasp hers, Father Michael, offering silent support. When the candles reignited, the living room was different. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. The furniture cast strange, twisted shadows that moved of their own accord. And there, in the center of the room, a shimmering portal had appeared. "The gateway is open," Madame Celeste announced, her voice strained with effort. Sweat beaded on her brow, and Sarah could see her hands trembling slightly. "We must go through. Remember, what we see on the other side isn't real. It's the demon's realm, designed to confuse and terrify us. Stay focused on finding Jake." Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. As she passed through the portal, she felt a sensation like icy fingers running down her spine. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a twisted version of her own home. The walls were covered in a pulsating, vein-like network, and the air was thick with a sulfurous smell. Father Michael and Madame Celeste appeared beside her, their faces grim with determination. "Stay close," Madame Celeste whispered. "The demon knows we're here." They moved cautiously through the warped house, every step feeling like walking through molasses. Distorted whispers echoed around them, sometimes sounding like Jake, sometimes like something far more sinister. "Nan?" Jake's voice called out from upstairs. "Mom, help me." Sarah's heart leapt, and she instinctively moved towards the stairs. But Madame Celeste's firm grip on her arm stopped her. "Remember," the priestess warned, "it will try to trick you. We must stay together." As they ascended the stairs, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in around them, pulsing faster. At the top of the stairs, they found themselves facing 3 identical doors. "Which one?" Father Michael asked, his voice tight with tension. Before Madame Celeste could answer, all 3 doors flew open simultaneously. From each doorway came the sound of Jake crying out in pain and fear. Sarah felt torn, her maternal instincts screaming at her to run to her child. But Madame Celeste's earlier warning echoed in her mind. "It's a trick," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Jake isn't behind those doors." Madame Celeste nodded approvingly. "Good. Now we must find the true path. Father, your faith will guide us." Father Michael closed his eyes, murmuring a prayer under his breath. After a moment, his eyes snapped open, and he pointed to the middle door. "This way," he said with certainty. As they stepped through the doorway, the cries from the other doors turned into inhuman shrieks of rage. The room beyond was a nightmarish version of Jake's bedroom. Toys moved on their own, their innocent forms twisted into grotesque shapes. And there, in the center of the room, stood Jake. But Sarah knew immediately that this wasn't her son. His eyes were completely black, and his smile was too wide, too cruel. "Welcome, Mother," the thing wearing Jake's face said, its voice a horrifying blend of childish innocence and ancient malevolence. "Have you come to join us?" "Where is my son?" Sarah demanded, surprised by the strength in her own voice. The demon Jake laughed, a sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "He's mine now," it said, "just as you will be." Suddenly, the room began to shift and warp. The walls melted away, revealing a vast, hellish landscape. In the distance, Sarah could see a small figure huddled alone, surrounded by writhing shadows. "Jake," she cried out, recognizing her son even at this distance. The demon lunged at them, its form shifting into something monstrous. But Madame Celeste was faster. She threw a handful of herbs into the air, chanting rapidly. The demon recoiled, shrieking in pain. "Go," Madame Celeste shouted to Sarah. "Get your boy. We'll hold it off." Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran across the hellish landscape, her feet barely touching the ground. As she got closer, she could see Jake more clearly. He looked pale and terrified but alive. "Mom!" he cried out when he saw her, reaching out with trembling hands. But before Sarah could reach him, a dark figure materialized between them. It was massive, its form constantly shifting, but Sarah recognized the malevolent presence from that night in the kitchen. "He's mine," the demon growled, its voice shaking the very air around them. Sarah felt fear threaten to overwhelm her, but then she thought of all Jake had been through, of how much she loved him. She stood tall, facing the demon. "No," she said firmly, her voice ringing with maternal fury. "He's my son, and I'm taking him home." The demon roared in fury, lunging at Sarah, but at that moment she felt a surge of warmth flow through her. She realized it was love. Her love for Jake, for Ethan, for David, burning bright and pure. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the demon. It screamed, recoiling as if burned. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran to Jake, wrapping him in her arms. "Close your eyes, sweetheart," she said. "Think of home. Think of how much I love you." As the demon raged around them, Sarah focused all her thoughts on home, on safety, on love. She felt a tugging sensation, and then they were back in their living room. The real living room. Father Michael and Madame Celeste were there, looking exhausted but relieved. "You did it," Madame Celeste said softly, a look of awe on her face. "Your love was stronger than its hatred." Sarah hugged Jake tightly, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "You're safe now." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The demon was still out there, and there were other families, other children who might need help. As dawn broke, casting warm light through the windows, Sarah made a decision. She would learn from Madame Celeste, train with Father Michael. She would make sure no other family had to go through what they did. The road ahead would be difficult, but as she looked at Jake, safe in her arms, Sarah knew it would be worth it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. stronger for the trials they had overcome.